Somewhere out there, somebody has been praying about the same thing for so long they've started to wonder if God even hears them anymore. Not because they stopped believing, not because their faith isn't real, but because it's been months, maybe years, and the silence on the other end has started to feel like a verdict. Like maybe the answer is no, and nobody had the courage to tell you. I want to talk to you today about the silence, because I think you've misunderstood what it means, and that misunderstanding has been quietly costing you your peace. You've been asking God for a breakthrough, a door to open, a body to heal, a marriage to mend, a prodigal to come home, a job, a child, a diagnosis, a relationship, something specific, something you've named in prayer more times than you can count. And every day that passes without an answer feels like one more piece of evidence stacking up against you. Evidence that maybe you're praying to an empty room. I need you to hear me clearly today. Silence is not the same as absence. You have confused God being quiet with God being gone. Those are two completely different things, and the difference between them is going to determine whether you keep standing in faith or whether you quietly give up right before your breakthrough. Think about the people you trust the most in your life. The ones who show up for you. The ones whose love you've never had to question. Are they only present when they're speaking? Of course not. Some of the deepest moments you've ever had with the people who love you happened in silence. Sitting in a hospital waiting room with someone, not saying a word, and somehow still knowing you weren't alone. Silence, in the presence of someone who loves you, is not rejection. It's intimacy that doesn't need to perform. Why would it be any different with God? You have been treating his silence like abandonment when it might actually be the most present he has ever been in your life. Quietly working, quietly building, quietly preparing something you are not yet ready to receive. Here's something that took me a long time to understand, and I want to save you the years it took me to get here. God is not silent because he's absent. He's silent because some things cannot be rushed without being ruined. Think about anything of real value in your life. A relationship that actually lasted. A skill you actually mastered. A character trait you actually developed. The kind that shows up automatically now, without you having to force it. None of that happened overnight. None of that happened in the loud, visible, dramatic moments. It happened in the quiet, repetitive, unremarkable stretches of time that nobody was filming, that nobody was clapping for, that felt, in the moment, like absolutely nothing was happening. That's where you are right now. And I know it doesn't feel like it. I know it feels like wasted time. But some of the most important work God has ever done in a person's life, he did in the waiting, not in the answer. Look at the story of Joseph. Sold by his own brothers. Enslaved. Falsely accused. Forgotten in a prison for years after he'd already done a favor for someone who promised to remember him and didn't. Years, not days. Years of silence. Years of a story that looked, from the outside, like God had completely lost track of him. And the whole time, silently, invisibly, God was positioning him. Not despite the prison. Through the prison. Every year Joseph spent forgotten was a year God was preparing him for a moment Joseph couldn't have survived without it. If the answer had come early, Joseph would not have been ready for what the answer required of him. Some of you are in a prison season right now. Not literally, but it feels like it. Stuck, forgotten, passed over, waiting on a promise that seems to have gotten lost somewhere between heaven and your life. I need you to consider the possibility that you are not forgotten. You are being prepared, and the two can look identical from the inside. Think about Hannah, praying so desperately for a child that the priest watching her assumed she was drunk, because grief that deep rarely looks composed. Years of a womb that stayed closed. Years of watching other women hold what she wanted more than anything. Years of silence from heaven about the one thing she'd built her hope around. And then, in what must have felt like the most ordinary of ordinary days, the answer came. Not because she finally prayed hard enough. Because the timing that had always existed finally arrived. Think about the Israelites, 400 years in Egypt, 400 years between the promise given to Abraham and the deliverance under Moses. 400 years is not a delay. That is multiple entire lifetimes. Grandparents died, still holding on to a promise they never saw fulfilled. And yet the promise was not broken. It was simply operating on a timeline none of them could see the shape of from where they were standing. I say all of this to tell you, your 2 years of waiting, your 5 years of praying about the same thing, your decade of watching a door stay closed, none of that is evidence that God forgot. It's evidence that you're in a story bigger than the part you can currently see. Here's what the waiting is actually doing, even when it feels like it's doing nothing. It's stripping away the version of the answer you wanted so that you can receive the version God is actually building. Most of us don't just want breakthrough. We want breakthrough on our terms, on our timeline, packaged exactly the way we imagined it. And God, in His silence, is often doing something far more valuable than giving us what we asked for. He's changing what we actually need so that when the answer comes, it fits a version of us that didn't exist yet when we first started praying. You are not the same person who started this prayer. You know that, don't you? Somewhere in this waiting, you have already changed. You've grown more patient than you used to be, even if you don't feel it. You've learned to trust in the dark in a way you never had to when everything was going your way. You've discovered a version of your own faith that only shows up under pressure, the kind of faith that doesn't need to see anything to keep believing. That's not nothing. That is the actual answer to a different prayer you didn't know you were praying. The prayer to become someone who could actually carry what you were asking for. So let me say some things to you plainly, because I think you need to hear them stated directly instead of implied. You are not forgotten. Silence is not evidence of absence. Waiting is not the same as being ignored. The fact that you haven't seen movement does not mean nothing is moving. Some of the most important things God has ever done in human history, He did quietly, slowly, over years that felt, to the people living through them, like nothing was happening at all. Stop measuring God's faithfulness by how fast the answer comes. Faithfulness was never about speed. It was always about presence. And He has been present with you this entire time, even in the silence, even in the stretch of days that felt the most empty. I want you to think about what you do with waiting from here forward, because you have a choice in front of you that matters more than you realize. You can spend this season resentful, bitter, convinced that you've been overlooked, checking out of your faith a little more with every day the silence continues. Or you can spend this season the way Joseph did, the way Hannah did, faithful in obscurity, faithful in the forgotten places, doing the next right thing even when nobody is watching and nothing seems to be changing. That choice does not determine whether the promise comes. The promise was never dependent on your performance. But that choice absolutely determines who you become while you wait for it. And who you become in the waiting is going to matter enormously once the answer finally arrives, because you are going to need to be a different person to carry it well. Some of you have been praying the same prayer for so long you've started to feel foolish saying it out loud anymore. I want to tell you something. Don't stop. Not because your persistence earns the answer. Grace doesn't work that way. But because prayer was never just a transaction where you make a request and wait for a delivery. Prayer is relationship. It's staying in the room with God, even when He hasn't said anything back in a while. It's choosing presence over performance. And that kind of praying, the kind that continues without needing an immediate answer to justify itself, is some of the most honest faith a person can have. You are not too far into the silence for this to still turn around. There is no expiration date on a promise from God. Sarah was 90. The Israelites waited 4 centuries. Joseph waited over a decade in circumstances that looked nothing like the dream he'd been given as a boy. Time is not the enemy of the promise. Time is simply the space in which the promise gets built into something strong enough to hold what it was always meant to carry. Let me speak to a few specific kinds of silence, because I don't want this to stay abstract. I want you to be able to place your own life inside of it. If you've been praying for healing, for yourself, or for someone you love, and the tests keep coming back the same, and the treatment isn't working the way you hoped, and you're starting to wonder if this is just how the story ends, I want you to hear this. God's silence in a hospital room is not His absence from it. He has sat with people in the hardest rooms of their lives, in the middle of outcomes nobody would have chosen, and He has not left a single one of them. Healing does not always look like the body being restored on your timeline. Sometimes it looks like a peace that has no natural explanation, sitting right in the middle of circumstances that should have produced only panic. That peace is not nothing. That peace is Him, in the room, in the silence, doing exactly what you asked Him to do, even if it doesn't look like what you pictured. If you've been praying for a marriage that feels like it's barely holding on, years of trying, years of hoping the other person changes, years of wondering if you're just going to spend the rest of your life feeling alone next to someone you share a bed with, I want you to hear this. God has not stopped working on hearts just because you can't see the progress from where you're standing. Change in another person is some of the slowest, quietest work there is. It rarely announces itself. It builds, invisibly, and then one day you look up and something has shifted that you can't even point to the exact moment of. Keep praying for that heart. Keep showing up with love instead of resentment, as much as you're able. The silence in a marriage is not proof that nothing is happening between two people and the God who made them both. If you've been praying for a wayward child, a son or daughter who walked away from everything you raised them to believe, who won't answer your calls, who seems to be running as fast as they can from the very faith you try to hand them, I want you to hear this. Every single prodigal story in Scripture has the same shape. A father who never stopped watching the road. A love that didn't require the child to earn it back before it was offered. And a homecoming that, when it finally happened suddenly, after a silence that must have felt endless to the one still waiting. Keep watching the road. Your child's silence toward you is not the same as God's silence toward your child. He is present in places you are not allowed to go right now. Trust Him there. If you've been praying for provision, for a job, for relief from debt, for enough, just enough, to stop the constant low hum of financial fear that follows you into every decision, I want you to hear this. God has never once been confused about your need. He is not waiting to see if you'll figure it out on your own before He steps in. Provision often comes through the most unlikely, unglamorous doors. A phone call you didn't expect, an opportunity that didn't look like what you were praying for, a season of learning to manage less that teaches you something you'll need once you have more. Don't despise the small, quiet provisions along the way while you're waiting for the big one. They are not evidence that the big one isn't coming. They're evidence that He hasn't stopped taking care of you even in the meantime. Here's something else I need you to consider. Sometimes what feels like silence from God is actually you not recognizing His voice in the form it's currently taking. We tend to expect God to speak the way we want Him to, clearly, dramatically, unmistakably, on command. But so often He speaks through a friend's unexpected phone call, through a verse that suddenly lands differently than it ever has before, through a peace that shows up uninvited in the middle of a moment that should have been chaos, through a door quietly opening that you almost walked past because you were so focused on the door you'd already decided was the right one. Don't miss the answer because it doesn't arrive wearing the costume you expected. I also want to say this because I think it matters. It is completely all right to tell God the truth about how the waiting feels. The Psalms are full of exactly that kind of honesty. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? These are not the words of people with weak faith. These are the words of people who were honest enough to bring their real questions into a real relationship, instead of performing a version of faith that never admits it's tired. You do not have to pretend the silence doesn't hurt. Bring the hurt to Him directly. That is not the opposite of faith. That is what faith actually looks like when it's being lived by an honest person instead of a performer. So if you are in the silence tonight, I want you to hear this clearly, without any decoration around it. God has not forgotten you. He is not distracted by someone else's more urgent request. He is not withholding good things out of carelessness. He is present in this exact moment, in the quiet, doing work you cannot see, on a timeline you were never meant to control. Keep praying. Keep showing up. Keep believing in the dark what you once believed in the light. Your silence is not the end of the story. It's the part of the story that nobody claps for, the part that happens off camera, the part that looks like nothing, right before it becomes the very thing everyone remembers. God is not silent because He forgot you. He's silent because He's building something in you that only silence could build. Hold on. It's still coming.